Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Farmers Weekly webinar on how best to plan your farming, retirement and pension. My name is Andrew Meredith and I'm Farmers Weekly editor and your host for this evening. I've worked for Farmers Weekly for almost 5 years now in a number of roles, and I stepped up to editor at the beginning of this year. As the son of farming parents who are themselves slowly mapping out their retirement plans at the moment, I know how tough this can be. For so many farmers, farming is both a job and a way of life, and contemplating stepping back from a business that you've worked so hard at for so long can be very daunting. And even for those who are looking forward to an end to the daily grind or a slowdown in pace, the challenge of handing a business on or sorting out your affairs in the best way possible can seem fraught with difficulty. These include age-old questions of succession, tax and financial planning, but the topic has been recently thrust into the spotlight by DEFRA's plan to offer English farmers a lump sum in lieu of several years of subsidy payments to leave the industry perhaps a little earlier than some had intended. Well, that's the plan anyway. As well as providing a new financial angle, this has raised interesting questions about the government's inference that it wants older farmers to make way for younger farmers who it sees as better placed to implement its plans for the environment. Are they right or wrong? Are we on the cusp of a significant acceleration in the number of people leaving the industry as direct payments fade away for some farmers over the next few years? What are the most common pitfalls for those thinking about retiring, and how can they be avoided? Joining me to discuss policy and problem solving today are a team of experts, two representatives of our sponsors this evening from Penny Financial Partners, as well as George Dunn from the Tenant Farmers Association and Amandeep Corporal from the AHDB. I will introduce them fully one at a time and give them the floor for some opening remarks, which will occupy about the first 30 minutes. Then we will have a question and answer session, which will allow you to follow up on what you've heard. I will also pose some of the questions that you've submitted during the registration process. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker this evening. Amandeep Corporal is a senior policy analyst at the AHDB. She joined the policy and economics team in July 2018, and her work includes understanding and communicating the potential impact of domestic agricultural policy and trade deals on UK agriculture. Prior to her current role, she was part of the market specialist team at the AHDB, analysing the global and domestic cereal and oilseed market. She has a master's and PhD in chemistry from University College London. We're grateful to have you this evening, Amandeep. Over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be part of this event and hope to share information with you that you'll find useful. So as Andrew said, at AHDB, my job is to analyse trade deals and change in domestic policy, see what that means for farmers and the wider industry, and to communicate the key messages. And there's no doubt that currently there's a lot of significant change going on all at the same time. As farmers, you're facing a double whammy, because on one side, you're dealing with the removal of direct payments and getting to grips with the new agri-environmental schemes that are being rolled out. Then on the other hand, there's new trade deals being negotiated, which will also have an impact on you to some extent. It's really a lot to try and navigate and get your head around while you're trying to run your business. The gradual reduction and eventual elimination of direct payments is probably going to be the biggest challenge that you're facing. If we look at the 2019-20 figures for farm business incomes, we see that basic payment is effectively keeping grazing livestock farmers with positive profit margins. For cereals farmers as well, 61% of total farm business income is from basic payments. So once that's gone, how will that gap be filled? Well, some of it, or how much of it, will be filled by payments from the new agri-environmental schemes, such as the Sustainable Farming Incentive. You need to bear in mind, though, that these schemes are not meant to be like-for-like replacements. Yes, you will need to look at your overall business and make other changes. Or if you're not going to take part in these schemes, how else could you adapt? For example, would you diversify, look at other non-farming streams of income, or make other changes on farm? Another option is to retire and leave the sector and do something different altogether. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that if that's what's best for you. And that's specifically what we're talking about today. A lump sum exit payment will be available for those who want to leave the sector in 2022. And the idea behind that is to give those who want to retire or leave farming to do so, and also to help new entrants. DEFRA put out a consultation document on the lump sum a few months ago, and that closed last week on the 11th of August. I've summarised that 30-page document into a short article to take a look. The link should be available. But the key points to note are that it's proposed that the lump sum offer will only be made in 2022. If you take up the lump sum, then you'll have no more direct payments until the end of the agricultural transition period, which is basically to the end of 2027. You must give up your land by selling it or renting it or transferring it by gift. And if you're a tenant, you must give up your tenancy if you want to qualify for the lump sum. There's a cap of £100,000 on the amount. And if you take the lump sum, you'll be paid what you would have got in direct payments until the end of the transition period, but it'll all be in one go. Because of that, there is a 3.5% discount factored in. As yet, we don't know if the lump sum is going to be taxed yet. The only information that's been provided by DEFRA is that they're in consultation with HMRC and there'll be news on this at a later date. So as I said before, it's a lot to take in. So if you don't know where to start, I'd say the first thing to do is probably to work out how the loss in direct payments is going to affect you. The deductions are being made in a similar way to how our income tax is calculated. But to save you the time and bother of having to go through this, the HDB Business Impact Calculator will do it all for you in a couple of clicks. So you'll get a breakdown of what you'll get from now until the last payment in 2027. So if you haven't done so already, I'd recommend you have a look at that. Once you've got an idea of how your income is going to be affected, then you can start to plan or think about what you need to do, what changes you need to make. And the truth is that the majority of businesses will need to make changes. But just be aware that there is no single solution and you'll need to see what works best for you. HDB have secured funding from DEFRA's Resilience Fund, which will be used to help you work your way through the change and help you to future-proof your business. The Farm Business Review tool is available now, and the Business Impact Calculator is part of this. So you can sign up completely free of charge, have a consultant go through your business figures, etc. with you on a one-to-one basis. You can see how your farm's performing, discuss priorities, and what actions you might want to take. As I mentioned earlier, the lump sum is only available in 2022, so it's best to start looking at all of your options sooner rather than later. My view is that just make sure you've got all the information and resources you need that are available to help make your decision. Because the way I see it, there's no generic right or wrong answer. It's very personal and individual to you and your specific circumstances. Just make sure that whatever decision you do make, you've had the time and the means to think it through carefully. So a lot of the material I refer to is on the HDB website. The links should be provided. So please go and have a look and make use of those. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Amandeep. Next up, we have David Penny, who is CEO of Penny Financial Partners, which is affiliated with St James's Place, one of the UK's leading wealth management organisations. His expertise is intergenerational wealth, tax and estate planning, and ensuring the well-being of his clients. David's also an advocate for better financial education, and outside of work has raised thousands of pounds with his wife Beverly for the charity supporting Nepal's children. David, you're up.
Come off onto speaker. Andrew, thank you for those kind words, and also to Amandeep and the organisation for simplifying the document of 30 pages. I think that's a real win. But in respect of what I'd like to say, sort of perhaps about us and also some of the context that we might sort of get into when we particularly go into the Q&A session. I think one of the constants for me in the 30 years that I've been doing this is that farmers have always been central to our clients. We've dealt with many over the years, and I'm delighted to say now we're often working with 2-3 generations and sometimes even 4 generations of family now. So if you'll forgive me, I just wanted to mention that Penny was set up 23 years ago by myself. We're based in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, but also where I am today in Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. I guess at a high level, the relevance to pensions is that we've been working with, say, for clients for all those years on intergenerational matters. I think that's been the real thrust of our specialism. Although Penny itself is a kind of full-service financial advice business in covering all areas, we've really built out a reputation in the intergenerational space, which more recently has accelerated into retirement, pensions being quite centre to that. At a macro level, I think succession and dependency is really what we're talking about here, financial dependency, that is. To some extent, maybe IHT, we may even come on to that with some of the Q&A. IHT has been there alongside sort of farming as a kind of perhaps a conduit, keeping to some extent people in farming, obviously with never letting the tax tail wag the dog coming to mind. I think it's fair to say that quite a few farmers have stayed in farming for IHT reasons, the kind of dying in the fields mindset, if you wouldn't mind me being so blunt, at the heart of that. Look, I think retirement planning, I will be quite straight about these things. I hope you'll appreciate that. I think retirement planning has drifted off the agenda for many people. In particular, pensions themselves have had a pretty mixed reputation. But I would like to acknowledge, if I may, that since 2015, pensions have changed dramatically. And so for me, pensions right now are the best they've ever been in my entire career. They changed in some legislation changes behind that, which opened up what we described at the time, or what was described at the time, as pension freedoms. What did come out of that was a degree of complexity, as always, when legislation changes, and that itself can put people off. But I please urge you to rethink, if you're not familiar with some of those rules, which we will aim to cover today, for you to do so with any trusted advisors. So I think the call out with things like BPS, for me, has been said already. It kind of points to a should you stay or should you go scenario from the farming perspective. And that's probably been around for a while. There's been a few pointers along those lines that we've observed, indicating that perhaps bigger farmers will survive and perhaps the smaller will not in the current form. Look, I will say, and therefore some of the questions could point to this as well, that we're here to try and create a financial or removal of financial dependence for our clients. And I think, and I would hope, that other financial advisors would take the same view. So ask all sorts of questions, please, of us. Benjamin Franklin's words, "Nothing is certain except death and taxes," definitely comes to mind. So should require some focus. And as Sonia Chowdhury Mills said also, you should really try to make your money make you money. And as simple as that sounds, that is one of the, I think, the real sort of key points to make. So keeping it at a kind of macro level and keeping it a little bit towards what we do, but pertinent to this afternoon. Yeah, we look forward to some questions coming from you. So back to you, Andrew, if I may.
Thank you very much, David. Death and taxes, indeed, the cheery topic for this afternoon's conversation. Look forward to questions on the latter, but perhaps not the former. George Dunn is Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association and has been in post since January 1997. He has represented the TFA on the Tenancy Reform Industry Group since its formation and was a member of Amaeth Cymru, the Welsh Government Strategic Framework Partnership Group for Agriculture. He also holds a number of other advisory roles linked to agriculture and is on the leadership team of the Reading Elim Pentecostal Church. George, over to you.
Andrew, thank you so much, and thanks to the team at Farmers Weekly for allowing me to take part in this really important webinar. And I'm here to wave the flag in respect of agricultural tenancy. So in the same way that planning can never start too soon for pensions, in my view, you can never start too soon to think about end of tenancy situations. So whether it's about progression or retirement, it's really important that individuals consider those issues almost from day one, because there's lots of things that an agricultural tenant has to think about if they are about to be exiting their holding, exiting the tenancy, or retiring from the farm. And I'm going to highlight some of those now, and no doubt some of them will come up in the Q&A a bit later on. So one of the really important issues is how have your investments in the holding been treated And will you be entitled to compensation for those investments, and on what basis? Now, typically, you can invest in a holding on the basis of it being a tenant's fixture, which you may be able to remove and sell independently, or a tenant's improvement, where you can expect the landlord to provide you with compensation, but there may be a limit on the amount of compensation, or it may have been written down in a previous agreement. So understanding how those investments have been handled and what you might expect to get out of them at the end is going to be really important in your planning. Also, have you fulfilled your repairing obligations under the tenancy, and might you be liable to a charge from the landlord for dilapidations at the end of the tenancy, which may diminish the amount of resource that you have available? Also, are you involved in any agri-environment schemes which may need to be transferred over to the landlord or to an incoming occupier? And for those tenants who have statutory succession, making sure that the close relative who's going to succeed to the tenancy is both eligible and suitable can be a long-running process. It's not a shoo-in. So it's really important to ensure that for the 7 years prior to any decision to retire from the tenancy, if you are looking for succession, that you are looking at things like the livelihood and suitability of the candidate who's presenting themselves for succession. There may also be a likelihood of a payment from the landlord for surrender of the lease. That's more likely with private landlords, with tenants who are occupying under the Secure Agricultural Holdings Act agreements rather than the newer farm business tenancies. And also, when can you quit? Because you need to consider if you have the ability to leave the holding, and certainly with farm business tenancies, sometimes you could be locked into those for a long period of time and you may not have access to a notice to quit. There may be break clauses that you can use. So it's really important to think about those before you plan that retirement. And also, tenants who might be on county council smallholding estates may have a retirement tenancy where the landlord is required to provide suitable alternative accommodation. So thinking about how that plays through is quite important. And please, 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 if you do have a retirement tenancy, do not fall for the old trick that some local authorities use to try and convince you onto an FBT when you reach your retirement age, because then you lose your right to claim that suitable alternative accommodation. So I say that by way of introduction, just to give you the idea that there's lots of things that a tenant rather than an owner-occupier has to think about before they consider retirement or moving on from their holding. So turning specifically to the BPS lump sum exit scheme, what we do know is it was never going to be sufficient on its own to provide individuals with enough to retire. However, as part of a portfolio, so including a surrender payment from a landlord maybe, or live and dead stock, or compensation for improvements in fixtures, tenant right, etc., it could be a very useful catalyst to assist people into retirement. And we think that there are three principal groups who would immediately see benefit from the lump sum exit scheme. Firstly, small owner occupiers with no successors coming on board, who are now able, by the way in which DEFRA has put the scheme together, to hold on to the ownership of the land, but to let it out so that they can keep that value for the long term. Obviously, if you've read the consultation document, you'll have seen that the requirement is for those tenancies to be at least 5 years. We in the Tenant Farmers Association have said that's too short. We think that owner-occupiers need to be letting for 10 years and more to give sustainability and resilience to those individuals who are taking those agreements. But for small owner-occupiers without succession, we think that's a really important aspect. Also, tenant farmers who already have identified a potential successor who they know is eligible and suitable to take over the farm could take advantage of this, because the retiring tenant takes the scheme and the new tenant coming forward comes into the agreement but doesn't have access to the BPS entitlements, obviously. And finally, tenant farmers who have already engaged with their landlords over a potential surrender deal may be in pole position to add to that what might be available under the BPS lump sum exit scheme, particularly if the offer previously made by the landlord was insufficient to give the tenant enough to leave. And I should say, as an aside, we have become a little bit concerned that some landlords who have been in previous negotiations with their tenants and have offered sums previously are beginning to reduce those sums on the basis that the tenant has access to the basic payment exit scheme, which we think is entirely inappropriate and something we've raised in our consultation response. So, in conclusion, in taking part in the lump sum scheme, as a tenant farmer, you really need to know when you can exit your tenancy and when you have the ability to give up that agreement. Bearing in mind that, as Amandeep said, this is going to be a once and for all application, and we don't know how long you have to exit, but we think it might be around the 2-year mark before you have to go. So tenant farmers have much to think about when thinking about retirement, thinking about taking the BPS lump sum exit scheme, and I would advise you not to leave it until the last minute, but to make sure you use this time now to prepare well for when the scheme is fully announced. So Andrew, that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. Back to you.
Plenty to think about there, George, indeed, from a tenant's perspective, the landlord, and of course owner-occupiers too, but it's great to have you to bring that voice for the tenants and answer some of those issues in more detail in a bit, hopefully. But before we get into the Q&A, our final speaker this evening is our second guest from Penny Financial, Stephen Woodford. Stephen's a chartered financial planner with the firm and joined them after working for a major investment bank in the City of London. Prior to working in financial services, Stephen developed software for warships, and I'm told he brings the same analytical and technical approach developed during that time when working with clients today. So what's on your radar this evening, Stephen?
Very good, thank you. Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everybody listening in this evening. Yes, you can tell from that introduction that I'm not a farmer or from a farming family, but do work with a number of farmers. As I've been working closely with David for approaching 7.5 years now. And that, like he's mentioned, we have a good number of farmers amongst our clients. Some of those are retired now, if farmers ever really do retire, and many are working towards or putting plans in place, and we are helping with sort of intergenerational strategies and thinking sort of along those lines. One thing I found in that sort of 7 and a bit years is that farmers naturally tend to make good investors. I find they may approach these thought processes from a slightly different angle, but a lot of our farming clients are naturally long-term thinkers. You know, you're thinking next year, next season, next generation, succession. Long-term thinking is kind of ingrained into running a successful farming business. The other thing farmers intrinsically understand is markets. How prices move, supply and demand, things going up, things going down, good years, bad years, and a lot of things that we spend time discussing and if you like sort of educating clients on, getting to understand the way things work. Farmers kind of get that, sometimes from a different angle, like I say, but they grasp that very, very well. Now, whilst we do appreciate, some farms that we see are, really large, complex businesses. Another trait that we notice with farmers is a desire to keep things simple where possible. That's absolutely something we endorse, and it's a big part of the way we like to work with our clients is to reduce complexity where possible. Sometimes you have to go through complex to get to a simple solution, but that is definitely worth the effort from what we see. So how can we or how do we help clients approach their retirement planning? As David alluded, with a farming context, it's often around how can we reduce financial dependence on the farm to allow you to step back for another generation to take in, to sort of step in. And really the main sort of thrust of that, I suppose, is how can we build non-farm assets, which again that does go against the natural instinct for some farming clients whose views for their lifetime has been to expand the farm, build the farm. Unless a farm sale is on the horizon, which is going to obviously produce capital, which will help with retirement. It's about building non-farm assets alongside the farming business, which will become your future source of income and financial security. That really helps to give you flexibility, give you options and choices alongside retirement. I know that's the main focus of this evening, but often succession to farming and non-farming beneficiaries is on our clients' mind. Having assets other than the farm helps to potentially provide an inheritance for non-farming beneficiaries. There will always be the difficulties and the debates over what is fair versus equal, and how you can preserve the farm and keep a farm intact. Again, having other assets only helps. Another observation, again, our farming clients really tend to appreciate efficiency, and that, again, that's another thing that we work quite a lot with our clients on. You can achieve that in many different ways. For ourselves, a big part of that is tax efficiency. We work with our clients to basically minimize tax, help, and really that's through maximizing the use of the various reliefs, allowances and exemptions that we all have available to us. Pensions have been mentioned already. David alluded to some fairly large-scale changes that came along 6 years or so ago now that really changed the landscape. What that really introduced was a lot more options, flexibility and choices over how and when pensions are accessed. And in some cases, indeed, if they are accessed. Legislation today means that in many cases your pension is outside of your estate for inheritance tax. Therefore, they can be very efficient assets to leave as a legacy now. Some things didn't change with regard to pensions. The main one being the tax relief on contributions, which is incredibly valuable. There's been constant talk of whether that will change, and it's been a certainty for the last few years, but nothing has changed yet. But contributing into a pension is incredibly tax efficient, even more so, arguably, if any of your business is incorporated. Contributions from a company are even more so. So pensions are one of the big building blocks of how we build these non-farm assets. Another that I'm sure I would expect most, if not all, people on the webinar this evening have heard of be ISAs. ISAs are another really important vehicle or pot that we can put assets into very tax efficiently. They don't share the IHT relief that pensions do, but with the exception of inheritance tax, ISAs are free of pretty much any other form of tax and are an incredibly useful way to build assets. Again, it's not just about how we're structuring assets, it's how we structure your income. There are allowances to do with income. We can have tax-free income earnings. There are allowances for dividends. There are allowances for interest, for capital gains. All of these, can be really valuable. And if we can help our clients to structure their assets in the most efficient way to make use of them, then that helps drive a better result and a better return. As a sort of parting statement, what can you do, or what should you do? I think review your plans is a good starting point. If you don't have plans in place yet, make a start. There's a Chinese proverb: the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We can apply this a lot in a sort of investing way, but one way you can look at that is the benefit of compounding. Just to give a little example, I'll finish with some numbers. If you were to invest £700 a month for 20 years, and very simple 5% net return per year, ignoring tax charges, just a simple 5% growth, that would give you a fund of £1 million. To achieve the same over only 5 years, you'd need to be putting aside £15,000 a month. So that's my little illustration of how powerful time can be on your side when making plans. And I think we are done with the introductions.
Perfect. 15 grand a month. I'll make sure to be putting that aside from my vast earnings as Farmers Weekly editor. I think not, but that's brilliant. We're running right to time, and look, as people have already alluded to, everyone in their opening statements, there's a huge amount of complexity here. There's a huge amount of avenues we could go down in the Q&A. So I'm really going to try and hone in the questions on sort of 3 topics this evening. I want to talk, some advice for those of you who are joining us who are close to retirement, and we'll try and focus on that for a little while and what you need to do to perhaps start that formal planning process. We'll have a bit of time, hopefully, looking at advice for people who are a bit further away from retirement, and we'll touch on pensions and things again a bit in more detail about how to start putting stuff away there. But first of all, let's just come back to the context about why now is such a critical time to be talking about this more than ever. I'll come back to you, Amandeep. We've talked about the lump sum exit scheme, but let's just go right back to basics and remind everyone on the call about that tapering of the direct payments and why everyone should be looking at their business now in more detail, perhaps if they haven't for a while. When are those direct payments going to be fading away for farmers in England?
They've already started, Andrew. So depending on how much you get, the more you get, the higher the percentage reduction will be year 1, which is now 2021, and then subsequent years that deduction kind of grows. But the more you earn, you're going to get a steeper reduction, so to say. The higher your BPS and value that you get, that reduction will be steeper for you rather than someone who earns at the lower band. So it's already started, and from the point of view of the 2022 deadline, it's because what Defo said, that if they do it any later than that, because there's one of the things that people are thinking about is that it's give me enough time to think about what to do. I mean, this is just next year, so how am I supposed to plan all these things and sort everything out if I'm going to leave? There's so much to think about. But the reason that they've given is that if they leave it any later than that, then the pot that you could get from the lump sum will be smaller, because that amount is finite, because the Treasury has obviously got limited capacity. There's not going to be, they're not pulling out some new money from somewhere. It's what you're going to be earned, what you're going to be given over those years. Let's give it to you in one go. So if they delay it any further, then your ultimate lump sum at the end will be a lot smaller. So that's why there's kind of the urgency to try and start thinking about it now, because it's already happening from now. So the sooner you think about it and make plans, the better.
And George, that's the key point, isn't it? Things seem to be happening at such a pace here. It's next year this scheme will be launched. We still don't know what the tax implications of it are. Is there anything else in particular that you want to know about this scheme, and are you still making requests of government in helping to shape it?
Andrew, there's always more detail that we need to make sure that we are providing the amount of advice and information to our members that they need, and it's always in the nitty-gritty. It's always the most difficult situation. So, for example, one of the issues of concern that's been raised by our members is what happens if you're in a partnership and it's the partnership that's been the applicant for the BPS. The current consultation says you've all got to give up farming, but what if you've brought in a younger member of the farming family into that partnership in the past 2 or 3 years who you are intending to be the successor of your business going forward? It's entirely inappropriate that they should be saddled with having to retire from the industry when actually they were due to be coming in as the new blood. So we're asking for those younger, more recent partners to be excluded from the requirement to give up entirely. Yes, they won't have access to the BPS. We get that. But we need to have those sorts of nitty-gritty questions really sorted out. But you're right, 3 years from Health and Harmony. We're 5 years since the referendum, and here we are still scrabbling around for final details of some of these schemes.
Well, we had a question submitted from Teresa Pemberton before the start of the broadcast, who was asking about how we treated for tax. So, Teresa, I know that doesn't answer your question fully, but the answer is we still don't know. You'll still have to keep reading your Farmers Weekly, I'm afraid, and all those other sources of information to find out. But that is really the key point about, even for those farmers who it might be an option for, that is the key point about whether or not they'll be looking to take it up, I'm sure. But another key point, David, if I can come to you, is, just this point about how big a deal is it going to be? We had a question from Sue Gilbard, and she was making the point, down there in the southwest, she sees a stalemate going on because many older farmers are going to have to stay farming on estates because this simply isn't going to be enough to help them to retire. This can only be one part of the puzzle, and the rest of their assets and their normal planning is going to have to still play a big role, isn't it?
Andrew, yeah, for sure. I guess some of both Stephen and my comments would kind of point to our feelings on this, that you do have to look at the bigger picture, and certainly the comment around the portfolio is referenced, that looking at it as a whole portfolio is super important. So this clearly isn't going to be any way sufficient, and to get to the place where it starts to kind of come together as a portfolio requires kind of maximising efficiency. And as I think all of us could acknowledge, £15,000 a month is not going to happen very often at all. So it's kind of the start early, but before that, it's absolutely making the most of what you've got already, and that's not to judge anyone on levels by any means. It's kind of it surprises us, put it this way, how few people keep a close eye on what they've already done in the past. Not least develop strategies from here on in. So Stephen called it out, really. Take a review, take a look, kind of figure out what you can do to maximize, and start to think of all of your not investments, which the word portfolio normally gets thought of against, and think of the farm, think of this payment, think of anything else that you might have to be able to put into that contribute. And really, they are things that can generate income, because stating the obvious, most people need income, not really capital as such. Capital, I'd hate to kind of just say it's as simple as capital is vanity and income sanity, but it's a bit like that. So, the things that can generate income should be the priority, and maximize what you've got. ISAs that are in cash ISAs may prove some degree of security, but they probably are pretty hopeless from an overall return. Pensions that have never been reviewed just defies the difference between, and I'm not saying we're always going to get the top performance here in Penny and via St James's Place, but we should be getting consistently good results, and that's when you get compounding effects. But the difference between good and bad in the investment world is tremendous. We all know the difference on charges is pretty significant, but the difference in performance is still remaining the biggest issue. So not really to call out our own, but more to just say some building blocks there, hopefully, Andrew, to try and think of the portfolio as a whole in an efficiency point.
Okay. Stephen, as David touched upon there, it is about the planning. And I'm sure there's some people on the call this evening who know they need to be doing it, perhaps have got various, investments, pensions floating around, and they've got various assets. We all know there's no such thing as a typical farmer, so let's not try and imagine this farm or that farm. But for those people who are thinking about going to see their financial consultant for the first time and sort of having that first chat, what are those first questions you're asking them, and what sort of information would you be asking them to bring along, even, so you can really delve into their business and give them some proper advice from the get-go?
Good question. I'd say there's two angles to that. We would consider sort of hard facts and soft facts. So there's the numbers. What existing assets are there? Your any cash, savings, investments, pensions, ISAs. What's our starting point? Assets and liabilities. Farm, non-farm is good to have. The next sort of level of information is around sort of income and expenditure, and I know this does get very murky in the farming world. It's not common to see a straight salary and then a typical current account paying your household bills, but it by knowing kind of what shortfall or surplus there is there on a monthly, annual basis, and the asset base that we're starting from, that gives us the angle of, okay, well, where can we start to look? What is on the table to do some planning with? That would cover sort of hard facts, and then I suppose soft facts, and the other angle of what we're trying to understand with our clients is, yes, where are you now, but what's important? Like, where are you trying to get to? And it's not about having answers. I want to sell the farm in 20 years' time, or I'm going to hand it on to next generation. But it's starting to have those thoughts, they're always thoughts that people are having, whether they've discussed them as a family or put them on paper, or if it's just something that runs away inside your head. After we've established the sort of hard facts, those are the kind of questions we're asking, which are sometimes difficult ones, and we don't always expect clients to answer. But I think part of our job is to ask those questions. What do you want? What does good look like? If we were, if we were sitting here in 10 years' time thinking, that went well, what would have had to happen to get us there? That's what leads to some of the more interesting conversations we have. And then it's about what can we put in place to try and bridge that gap, if there is one.
I was going to try and skirt around succession this evening, so we could end up talking about it for the whole time, but it's impossible to avoid in these discussions, isn't it? And that's a really nice way of putting it, the priorities. And once you unpick that, you sort of know what you want. You can look about how to get there, I guess. The tax issues, you've mentioned it, and I will just stay with you for a minute, that are so near the top of many farmers' minds. We've got a question here from John Russell. John, I hope you were able to join us. You sent this in beforehand, and he's just saying he's 76, he's widowed last year, he's got his family farming a few hundred miles away. He's looking to ease back now. But the thing he's really thinking is, how does he do it without paying the tax man? And that is, that's a blunt question, but that's how a lot of farmers are set up to think. Would you say, that should be his top priority, or should he be looking first about, more of those other objectives about what he wants?
I think it's a tricky one there. I mean, there's a few sort of things going on within the question there, I suppose. But the starting point is, what's the objective? Is it a sale of the farm, or you leasing land, or some that kind of rate? What does stepping back look like? And again, because then that leads us to say, well, what's on the table to plan with? Are we talking about a lump of capital, or are we talking about some income, or a combination of the two? Again, as I've sort of said, what are the non-farm assets are perhaps behind the scenes that could be brought into the picture. And I say, once you know what assets we're working from, what income we're working from, and the gap between what good looks like. As I said, it's about trying to make the use of all these allowances and things like I've said. If you perfectly structured your assets, to make the most of your personal allowances for income, for interest, for dividends, for all things like this, you can get into sort of a reasonable level of income just from those. If we've been able to build up ISAs, then we've got sort of tax-free income, things like that. It may not be the sort of perfect answer, but the earlier you can start to do things, the better. But yeah, to give a specific answer, I suppose it'd be more understanding of what the numbers are, really. Sure.
David, I'll come back to you. It is hard to know without specifics how to give advice to people, but even just starting out, in those early conversations, some people will just simply not know whether they can afford to retire. And is there even a vague rule of thumb where you can say, okay, I've got this much in my pensions, therefore I know I'll be able to earn this much annually from that? Can we give some sort of vague rules of thumb to folk listening this evening, or is it simply too difficult to say?
I think it's a fair question, and our world, and like many others in the professional world, we have to caveat everything that you say these days. But it's I think there's a way of kind of looking at the assets and what realistically is achievable from those. So if you took to come back at that, if you took a capital sum, I think it's very reasonable to say that a generated income could be somewhere in the region of 3 to 4% generated quite sustainably, and that for some will be read as a pretty low figure, and for others it will be tremendously high, because if you're used to cash deposits, you're way off 1% these days, so you're getting nigh on zero. But if you're used to investing, past performance has given clients returns 7, 8, 9%, 10% per annum at times. But I think if you want to sustainably grow income, we've always been fairly comfortable that yields from a good cross range of investments could get you around the 3 to 4%. And that's probably a little bit lower than where it was because of some of the impacts of the last 18 months in particular on financial markets, in particular on dividends and income generating assets. But I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb to help you kind of figure it out. £1 million, 30 to 40,000 pounds a year. And back to Stephen's point, get that tax efficient. We shouldn't be paying tax on it. So that's kind of money in the bank. If you haven't got it tax efficient, you can expect that that's going to be reduced somewhat, quite a lot probably, depending on your rates of tax. So I think that's one little kind of rule of thumb. If you get good returns and making your money work hard, one of the figures I was told years ago when I was back at Prudential, that really was a long time ago, you grow at 7% per annum, it's going to take 10 years to double your money. But if you grow at 3% per annum, it's going to take 23 years to double your money. And 3% is not exactly easy these days, let's say. So, it's these sort of things that you've got to be thinking about. And most of those numbers point to compounding, which some will relate to when they were back at school, which, like, if anyone's like me, that feels just ridiculously long ago. But compounding was one of the few things that I've since returned to in the kind of the mathematics sphere. And I think it's really interesting. It's really powerful. So I was going to go one more, if I may, just to say one more thing. We can map out some of this with the tools. You're going to expect me to say that, but we've got some really good tools that our clients typically won't have on their computers and probably would not want to have. But they map out likelihood of events. We call it cash flow forecasting and modelling, and it's really powerful to illustrate lots of what ifs.
Compounding a bit more useful perhaps than Pythagoras' theorem. George, did you want to come back in on that point?
Andrew, I was just thinking about the question from I think it was John, who was our farmer, that was wondering what to do with his situation. And obviously, David and I have been talking about generating income, and there are ways in which you can still remain involved in the farming industry, but take a back seat. So you might consider a contract farming arrangement where you're still involved in making the decisions and taking the risk in the business, but somebody else is doing the physical work. Or you could let the land out, and in John's case, he would still get 100% agricultural property relief on inheritance tax. He would have the residence nil rate band on the house if he wanted to continue living in that. If he let the farm out to a new entrant, he could consider a share farming arrangement to mentor and bring in a new entrant into the industry, or a joint venture. So I think it's not a black and white, do I continue farming or do I give up farming? There are ways in which individuals in this sphere can continue to be involved in sensible arrangements with other people.
Isn't it? You raised an interesting point there about the change in tax status then when you stop being an active farmer. Do we know if you take this lump sum, does that disqualify you for inheritance tax relief or business property relief? That would be a big concern for some people, perhaps.
Well, I'm not a tax expert, so please forgive me. But as I understand it, once you have retired as a farmer, then you don't have access to the tax reliefs that you would have if you were a farmer dying with your boots on, if you like. But there are other ways in which you can retain the inheritance tax benefits, for example, by letting the land out. So if you're an owner-occupier owning assets, you can take the lump sum exit scheme, let your land out, and still have those inheritance tax benefits.
Okay. Amandeep, I was thinking of trying to put myself in the position of someone who was maybe modelling retiring before we started this evening. I was thinking about just how good the markets are at the moment, and you've obviously followed the cereals and oilseeds in the past. You'll know that they're near historic highs. The beef and lamb markets are very good, and even milk isn't too bad at the moment. Do you think that will be encouraging some folk to get out at the top of the market, or perhaps will it tempt them to come back in, or perhaps what is just AHDB's view in general about how rapid perhaps people will be choosing to leave the industry in the next few years?
So no doubt about it, in some of the sectors they are boosting up rocket high prices at the moment, which people think, oh, what's the problem, this is great. What we always encourage you to look at is don't just look at the short-term shocks, because obviously it's better to have a longer term view. So look at the past 3-year, 5-year average, because that's more realistic. You're going to have those ups and downs, those troughs in the prices, but it's like, where's the general direction going? So that's what, in terms of business planning, I mean, like farming is not a day-to-day, like a short-term business. It's a long-term business. So you've got to look at things long-term, and that includes prices, price direction as well. Also, sorry, I forgot the other part of your question.
Just how are AHDB doing a forecast of how many farmers they think are likely to exit the industry?
We haven't done a forecast ourselves, but DEFRA did do a survey just beforehand. They published this consultation. It's in the back sort of appendix bit of the consultation, just saying that, out of interest, how many farms are thinking of leaving farming, and 20% I would say they want to continue farming, and then like a smaller proportion then was thinking they want to leave in the next 5 years, or they're thinking of leaving straight away. That was only like 5 or 6%. So there's the majority do want to stay in, and there's people that are thinking about it, and it's just about making so that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the people who want to get out, they're able to do so, give them the financial means, because they're seeing that might be a barrier for them to exit. But obviously there's lots of things to think about, as we've discussed. There's the complications in succession. How is it going to be enough for them to then live off afterwards, or how are things going to work? So that was overall, most people do want to stay in farming, but it's for those that maybe want to seek other pastures, or don't want to carry on with the things as they're going to be changing the domestic policy with removal of direct payments.
Let's just stay then on that lump sum for a question from Olivia Cooper this evening. David or Stephen, whoever wants to jump in. If someone takes the lump sum retirement scheme and they're lucky enough to be able to take the maximum 100k payout, £100,000, what would be best to do with that lump sum, would you say, at the moment? Is it maybe invest it into a new business, put it in your pension pot, or do something else entirely with it? What's the best to do with a lump sum at the moment?
Do you want to say something back to that first, Stephen?
Yeah. Again, I say sort of tricky one without context of what else may be around. When we're talking about in investing lump sums, the things that sort of come to mind would depend on time frame, like when and how might access be needed. Is this to generate an income now, or is this to access over time in the future? That would determine where we might start. We would want to get that money into the most flexible and tax efficient environment we could. In many cases, that would involve pension and or ISA. If those doors aren't open or they've already been maximised, then there would be other sort of structures that we would look at, and that's about sort of actually what pot would we look to put that money into, and then if it was a case of investing that money, then things like your time horizon and level of risk and are we gearing for growth or for income would sort of determine how we would actually then invest that money once it was in the right pot. The question did mention income there. As David alluded to, the way to generate the most sustainable income, if not necessarily the highest yield. I mean, you could go that would pay you 6 or 7 or more % a year. That isn't going to be a long-term solution, and you introduce some capital risk. In many cases, a good, balanced, diverse portfolio will give you a more sustainable level of income in that, maybe 3 or 4% range that David mentioned.
Okay. David, did you want to add anything there, or should we roll on to the next question?
I think roll on, because I think my points become a bit more generic than the specific question that Stephen's handled perfectly well there. So carry on. Go for it.
On those sort of big picture issues, then let's just, we've been very England centric so far, talking about the lump sum scheme, and I do apologise to listeners joining us from other parts of the UK or even further afield. How big a gulf do you think is going to sort of open up between England and the other regions in terms of the future for farming, different policies, and does that matter really for financial planning, or are the fundamentals the same sort of everywhere, would you say, still at the moment?
I just mentioned that. So at the moment, what we know is that the Welsh government have got something out there. It's like a consultation period where they're looking at what's going on with direct payments. So they haven't started making cuts to direct payments, and it's limited information at the moment. But what we do know is that they'll probably have something that's similar to the agri-environmental schemes that start in England. Like, for example, the sustainable farming incentive. In terms of how they're going to reduce direct payments, we don't have any information on that yet. All that they've actually published is that when they're going to look at their agricultural bill, their Welsh-specific agricultural bill in next year, 2022, that's when they're going to probably bring those things up. So at the moment, unfortunately, it's a bit, we're not sure whether they're going to go in that direction. And for Scotland, there's even less information. So obviously, as you said, it's going to be interesting to see like what difference there are and how, if there's what kind of level playing field there is, if it's going to be how level it will be. But at the moment, we just can't make any comparisons because we don't know what those changes are going to be.
Thank you, Amandeep. That's some really useful context there. So it's frustrating, I guess, is the word for those farmers in other areas not really having as much insight into which way things are going to go, but perhaps a bit more certainty in the short term about their payments. So I guess then, David, the answer to the second part of my question is it doesn't really differ that much in terms of financial planning at this stage.
Yeah, Andrew, I was going to add on that it doesn't really. We see in most financial planning, we're fortunate across the UK. Can't speak for outside of the UK. We don't really look at those jurisdictions. We can, but we don't specialise individually on them. We're pretty lucky that most tax legislation is very similar. There's a bit of an exception in Scotland for some of the trust rules and estate rules, but essentially for most general sort of financial planning, which we're sticking to today, we've got fairly uniform approach, particularly to tax. But yeah, I think from a wider point of view, I was, if anything, going to say that the situation is that I think most people, the planning that we're advocating the most is, we keep saying it, but kind of start early, but maximise the efficiency of what you've already got as a start place. In the round, I think we're less worried about. We see this scheme as being really helpful, and some of our clients are already coming in and talking to us about it. But they're all acknowledging this is just starting the conversation off. It's certainly not the answer. I wouldn't want it to be suggested that we believe it's the answer. And like, farms are a business. We've said that already. And like business sales. Planning early, starting early in the planning, not just the kind of investment sort of side of it, is really important. It may sound a bit crazy, but we prefer it not to be the case that a farmer comes to us when they've sold out. There would be so much more value in getting to know them and getting to kind of understand the circumstances in advance. I think that's the real point. Coming early. I know some of these payments is designed for next year, but it's, for us, the ideal scenario would be those sort of people who are kind of thinking about exiting in the next 5 years should start their thinking early on that front, and we can get a much better tax outcome, much better overall outcome, I'm sure. So I hope you don't mind me just taking that step. Sorry, that was just a wider point to make.
Sure. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. So as I said at the beginning of the Q&A, we spent, up until now really talking about the immediate future, and for people thinking about retiring, what they should be doing, touching it a little bit. But I want to spend the rest of our time, about the 15 minutes left, sort of really thinking about advice for the longer term. If you're a younger farmer joining us, or if you're an older farmer with successors and you want to pass advice on to them about financial planning, let's look at that in a bit more detail. George, I'm going to come to you. We're going to be a bit controversial here. We're going to put our friends from Pennies on the spot, but I'm going to come to you first. There's a few questions going to come in. I'm going to try and sum them up. In essence, they're saying, farming is tough enough as it is. I'm spending everything I am earning on maintaining and growing my business. I simply haven't got the ability to put money aside and plan for the future. I'm sure you'll know a lot of tenant farmers who are working very hard and feel that way. They're trying to build up a stake in something. Would you take their side? Is this all a bit pie in the sky, or should everyone be trying to do something for the long term?
Andrew, I always say that in farming, you need to use both your head and your heart. And if you're not passionate about this industry, you're not going to have very long within it. But if you don't do it smartly, you can find yourself in grave difficulty. And I think that individuals do need to be thinking about the long term as much as they are thinking about today. And I know that's really difficult to do, but I do get concerned when I see young people, particularly, who might have a house that they have been buying into, which they then cash in to invest in a farm, and the way in which they invest in that farm isn't perhaps as solid as you would want it to be in terms of getting a return on that investment and having that investment brought back to them at the end of the lease, or they sign up to a tenancy which has got very difficult repairing obligations or very difficult provisions within that lease. So my view is that actually you need to be, as a new entrant, thinking as much about your exit when you start as when you're trying to end, because you need to be making sure that you're planning your life ahead on that basis. So as tough as it is, Andrew, I would absolutely say that it's really important for people to be planning for their retirement from day one.
David, what is the minimum viable amount then for somebody? Let's say they're age 30. They've been farming for 10 years or maybe even a bit longer, and they've spent everything so far on tractors or livestock, or just expanding their business, and they come to you and they say, I've got nothing except my state pension, can't afford to put a lot away, help me out. How little is enough, shall we say?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. It's I was really tempted to say, anything makes a difference. I don't want to take away from the fact that small leads to smaller outcomes. So if we go really low, we're not going to get the impact. But circumstances change, and I think the point of time in, not timing, is really relevant here. So, if you can only do what you can do now, do it. Do a small amount. If that's £50 a month, if that's £100 a month, if that's £150. These numbers are all okay to do as far as we're concerned. But the more important thing is if you get into the kind of the habits, which I think good money habits, I think that's more important. And then when you can do more, or if there is a good year, or you've stopped buying tractors and other things, then you've got the chance to build on what's already there. So I've done this 30 years. I've said that earlier, and one of the core things is committing to something. Regular savings get people into a commitment and a habit, more so than just putting lump sums in, actually, which is becoming more of the flavor, I would say, than regular saving. But I think that's a shame, really, because I think the habit of saving regularly before, having your pay or your money, whatever, no, maybe not pay in farming, but if there's some amount due in and then having an amount going out pretty soon after is still a pretty good way of setting up an arrangement. Leave it another week and the money as a 30-year-old might have gone. So I think pay yourself or put these things in first. So again, simple to say, but not always to do. If you think you're earning £10,000-15,000 a year of profit, try and get by on 10% less than that and put that 10% away. These fixed to a percentage has always been a good one. So the other thing I wanted to just say back to this, which is a slight taking a question but adding to it, is you've sometimes got to maximize the efficiencies elsewhere to gain the efficiencies that are needed to do what we're describing this evening. And so what I mean by that is that there are classic situations where people aren't as efficient as they might be elsewhere in their budgeting, in their allocating, in their running of the business. I've run this business for a long time. We still have to gain efficiencies. We still have to keep looking at costs. So the same goes for your own household budgeting. So I think you have to drive efficiencies elsewhere, whether that's utilities or just what you spend on. If you ever have time to socialise or allowed to socialise, then what you do anywhere else might have an impact here. Is the point I'm making. So don't rule out that coming to us, we can discuss ways of trying to improve the likelihood. I'm not talking people up here. I'm just saying sometimes your instinct as to what you can do isn't entirely what you can do, and where you pay it from can make an awful lot of difference. Paying a pension, as Stephen said earlier tonight, from a company is the most efficient way to pay a pension anyway. And it's not even coming into your hands where you may have paid dividends, tax on dividends or tax on earnings. It's going straight from business to pension, not via you and some tax deductions. It's so you can make some of the efficiency gains in just simply where it's funded from. Or I've got one other thing to add, which is we deliberately have worked over these 23 years in the business with families. So not right for everybody, but sometimes we can look at the whole family situation and say, what, can we gain some efficiencies? We've got some farmers who are able, I'm pleased to say, to fund some of their younger children's investments for the time being. That is not an infinite game. That's going to stop, but they can do it to start and probably hand over when the time's right. And so we look at the wealth in its entirety. We look at the overall family portfolio, you might say, and see whether we can do some work there. Trust funds are a classic way of doing that as well. So sorry, I've probably babbled on a bit too much there, but that's a few thoughts.
No, interesting points, and I'm sure they'll resonate with folk. We've got a question here. One of the questions that was sort of alluding to these issues around affordability. I'll come to you for this one, Stephen. We've got Ian saying, he'd like a pension of around £5,000 a month at 65. Perhaps that won't be an unreasonable sum if he's 30 now. Work back from there. If that's his clear-cut objective, are you able to say sort of roughly what he should be putting away each month? He's got time on his side there around about 30, isn't he, or not?
Top of my head, no. but just to sort of talk through that, I suppose. Again, if we've sort of some of the income sort of potential figures we've talked about, if you're trying to generate £5,000 a month, 60,000 a year, from a pot, the pot would need to be in the order of sort of £1.5–2 million to be generating that level of income. Without, if you're happy to run the pot down, you could possibly generate that from a slightly smaller pot. But over a 30-year time frame, that's a fantastic sort of base to be working with. The power of starting now and getting that compounding effect. Again, I don't want to sort of throw sort of returns around, but as David mentioned one there, I talked about 5% before. 7% a year doubles your money in 10 years. If you get to do that 3 times, you're doubling it and doubling it and doubling it again. that's where your compounding comes in. So aiming, say, a pot of £2 million is a huge number to be targeting, but with a decent return and time, it's not ridiculous. The point I've made is, I've talked about keeping things simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. And that goes about what sort of David's saying. You've got to find money to commit to this. If the goal is to build something independent of the farm that can do this for you, then there is no other way than putting resources into it. And this isn't a problem unique to farming. It's something the nation and the world probably needs to look up to. Personally, I recently turned 40. I wouldn't want to absolutely bank on the fact that the state pension is there in its current guise when I come to retire. It's already being pushed back to 67, 68 before I can expect to get it. And the fact remains, today that state pension would get me about £9,000 a year. If I want to retire on more than that, I need to be doing something else. So there are no magic tricks. There's no easy answers. It's committing to a plan and doing what you can. If I could, just for one more minute, I saw the question come in for me, and he's talking about return. He's mentioned, everybody getting 1%. I say, if you're talking about investing in cash, you're lucky to get 1% right now. And you're lucky to get 0.5% right now. The reality is, if you want to grow money over the long term, cash is not going to give you that. It needs to be asset backed sort of investment, shares, bonds, a diverse portfolio, things that are more linked to inflation, linked to the real world, linked to the economy, linked to growth, with an appropriate amount of risk. And again, it's not easy, but it's possible. I didn't say 5% as an expectation, but it's not an unreasonable average. If you're looking over that sort of 20-30 year horizon, you want to be in that sort of range. You need to be, and more is possible, but that's not unrealistic, I don't think.
One quick fire question before I'll come to each of you for a final word. Briefly, David, are there any potential tax changes in the pipeline which are going to, we've talked about still needing more information on the lump sum, but is there anything else that farmers should be keeping an eye out for that may change their circumstances in the near future? Things I've seen a lot about Office for Tax Simplification over the last couple of years in Farmers Weekly. Are we expecting any more from them, for example?
Yes, probably is the straight answer. Loads of papers have been kind of pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, being kind of put on hold. I think we've all recognised that they need to kind of get that into the right place before they'll start rolling out some of the tax changes that are inevitable. So I think we've got line of sight for changes on a few things. They're well kind of publicised. Capital gains tax was big in the run up to the budget, and then it was determined it was too early to do the changes that they would have probably liked to have done. So we can see some reforms of CGT. I would call out that's probably some movement towards trying to get that nearer to income tax rates, away from the kind of 10 and 20% rate at the moment. There's an 8% on top of that for residential property. So I can see that seriously. We were getting a lot of papers and work, particularly by the Office of Tax Simplification, on IHT. Some of those measures were good. We think they would be positive, but overall there was probably a detrimental outcome to those of reasonable sort of wealth. So I would say, hold on to the thought that CGT is certainly not likely to stay where it is. What we ended up with which is really important to just mention, we did end up with a 5-year freezing of a lot of allowances and exemptions that has led to, what you'll get from that is a kind of fiscal drag. You'll get, if asset prices are going up, you're going to get more asset value exposed to tax, even if you just level those allowances, reliefs, exemptions. So that in a way is a kind of a change.
Okay.
So I would put kind of thoughts towards pensions, tax relief, CGT, and probably IHT are, you know, am I saying all taxes when I say that? And I'm not leaving many out there, am I? But, you know, I think we've just got to all expect quite a lot's going to change in the next 10 years or so.
Okay. Well, we're really tight for time now, but I just want to come back to you, Amandeep. Can you just remind us about the AHCB and the Resilience Fund and that free advice that is available for farmers now across, is it just England?
Yeah. So we've got some of the Deaf Resilience Fund, and it's there to help you. So please make use of it. It's completely free. Look on the website. There might be some links available. I can't see them, but there might be some links where there's a phone help desk number. You can get a one-on-one consultant to help you plan things through. I know it's very daunting to go through all of this, but you can have someone help you through it. So just make sure you take up the opportunity and, you know, start planning now. Like that's a common theme in all of this. Start planning now. So take that on board.
Well, I think there we are. We'll leave it on that, a nice freebie, but everyone here full of good advice. And unfortunately, we haven't got any time to take any more points on this very broad topic. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions this evening. Our panel will have a copy of all the questions, both pre-submitted and submitted this evening, which we didn't have a chance to get to. And I know they will respond to some more of them if they get a chance. I think we've all been left with a lot to think about, both in terms of issues for those who are planning an imminent retirement and advice for people who are further away from that time. But hopefully you'll all be equipped with some pointers on how to start planning for the future. For now, all that remains is for me to thank our 4 panellists, Amandeep, David, George and Stephen, for their time and expertise. I'd like to thank Penny Financial for their sponsorship of this evening, and to Laura and Ruth in the background for their organisational support both in the run-up and tonight. Finally, thank you all for attending. Thank you to those who tuned in on catch-up. I know a lot of you are busy at this time of year with harvest, and it's great to have you along live or afterwards, and I hope to see you all again soon for another Farmers Weekly webinar. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, everyone.